Every disaster I've lived through started the same way under soft lights, polite laughter, and the illusion that nothing bad was supposed to happen here. I was 33, married, a mother, sitting at a long table in a Denver restaurant surrounded by people who shared my last name. It was my father's birthday. Cameras were out. Glasses were raised. My mother stood to speak. What she said didn't cause chaos. It didn't need to. It landed quietly and changed the trajectory of everything that came after. At the time, I couldn't have known how far that moment would travel, that it would follow me into my marriage, into a hospital room, into police interviews and a courtroom where the word intent would be spoken out loud, that it would place my children, not just my feelings, at the center of real danger. This story isn't about one cruel sentence. It's about what people are capable of when humiliation isn't enough anymore, and how easily love can be used as a weapon. Before we go any further, if this story reaches something familiar in you, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if you choose to stay with me through what comes next, thank you for being here and for listening. I didn't grow up feeling unloved. That would have been easier to recognize. What I grew up with was something quieter, more confusing, a constant sense of being measured against a standard I could never see clearly, but somehow always failed to meet. There was always someone else. Not a specific sibling or rival, but a moving target. A cousin who listened better. A classmate who spoke more confidently. A neighbor's daughter who knew her place. These comparisons weren't delivered with anger. They were casual, observational, spoken the way people talk about the weather, and because they weren't loud, they sank deeper. My parents decided everything that mattered. What I wore to school, which friends were acceptable, which opinions were appropriate to express. They called it structure. They said it was for my own good. When I asked questions carefully, respectfully, the answers never addressed the question itself. They addressed my role. Children didn't need reasons. Children needed guidance, and guidance in our house meant compliance. The first time I pushed back, I remember the silence that followed more than the words, the way the air changed, the way my mother looked at me like I'd said something embarrassing out loud, the way my father leaned back and told me I was becoming difficult, ungrateful. Those labels stuck quickly. I learned that disagreement wasn't a difference of opinion, it was a character flaw. They reminded me often in subtle ways that my life was something they had given me, that every opportunity I had existed because of them, that independence was not a natural progression, but a debt unpaid. Whenever I expressed a preference that didn't align with theirs, it was reframed as selfishness. Whenever I wanted space, it was framed as rejection. So I adjusted. Quietly. I learned when to speak and when to stay still. I learned which parts of myself caused tension and began trimming them away. I became agreeable not because I agreed, but because agreement was safer. Silence became a strategy. Endurance became a virtue. I was praised for being mature, for not causing trouble, for understanding how things work. Over time, I stopped noticing how much of myself I was setting aside. That's the danger of growing up in an environment like that. It doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like discipline, like expectations, like love with conditions you assume everyone else has learned to live with better than you have. By the time I reached my 20s, their voices lived inside my head. I second-guessed every reaction before it fully formed. If something hurt, I looked for the reason I deserved it. If something felt wrong, I told myself I was being sensitive. I had learned to distrust my own instincts long before anyone else needed to. There were moments when the imbalance surfaced clearly. A remark that cut too precisely. A joke made at my expense that lingered longer than laughter should. But those moments were always followed by justification, by stories of sacrifice, by reminders of how difficult I'd been as a child. Guilt filled the space where clarity might have taken root. I didn't yet understand that this conditioning wasn't something you grow out of. It doesn't end when you move out or start paying your own bills. It waits. It adapts. It follows you into adult relationships, shaping what you tolerate and what you explain away. It teaches you to confuse discomfort with normalcy, control with care. Looking back now, I can see how carefully I was prepared for what came next. How my childhood taught me to normalize being diminished. How it trained me to believe that love required restraint, that if I asked for too much, I would lose everything. That lesson didn't stay in my parents' house. It came with me. When I later told myself that distance might fix things, that adulthood would rebalance the power, I was still operating under their rules. I believed that if I proved I was responsible enough, reasonable enough, respectable enough, the past would loosen its grip. I didn't yet realize that some families don't want reconciliation, they want access. And I had no idea how far they would go to maintain it. I met Lucas during a period of my life when I wasn't looking for rescue. I was looking for quiet. He didn't arrive with grand gestures or promises. He listened. He noticed when I went silent mid-sentence and didn't rush to fill the space. For the first time, I felt like I could exist without performing. That alone should have told me how starved I'd been. When I told my parents about him, their reaction was immediate and precise. They didn't ask how he treated me. They didn't ask if I was happy. They asked what he did for a living, where his family came from, what kind of connections he had. My mother smiled politely and said he seemed nice in the way people describe something temporary. My father didn't smile at all. They began introducing alternatives almost right away. Sons of business associates, men with recognizable last names, men who in their words made sense. They framed it as concern for my future, for stability, for image. Lucas, they implied, was a risk, a step down. Someone who would benefit more from me than I would from him. When I defended my choice gently at first, their tone hardened. They warned me not to be naive, not to confuse attention with commitment. My mother said love fades, but reputation doesn't. My father reminded me that marriage wasn't just personal, it reflected on the family. I recognized the pattern immediately. The message wasn't new. My wants were irrelevant when they conflicted with their expectations. Still, I chose Lucas. For the first time in my life, I made a decision knowing it would disappoint them, and did it anyway. The night before our wedding, my father pulled me aside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He simply said that if this marriage failed, I was not to come back looking for support. That I would be responsible for whatever consequences followed. It was framed as realism. I heard it as abandonment with conditions. After the wedding, something strange happened. My parents shifted. On the surface, they became agreeable. They attended family events. They smiled in photos. They asked about our plans. If I hadn't known them as well as I did, I might have believed we'd reached some kind of understanding. But underneath that politeness was a steady undercurrent of interference. Small comments, subtle doubts planted and left to grow. They questioned our financial decisions. They asked why Lucas changed jobs when he did, why we lived, where we lived, why certain milestones weren't happening fast enough. Nothing overt enough to confront directly. Just enough to create friction. Just enough to make me question whether I was being irresponsible, whether I'd misjudged something important. When our son was born, their interest intensified. They spoke often about legacy, about how children need structure, about how mistakes compound when you're raising someone else. Lucas remained patient. He tried to engage respectfully to clarify misunderstandings. I watched him do what I had done my entire life: explain himself to people who weren't actually listening. There were moments when I considered pulling back, creating distance. But old habits die slowly. Part of me still believed that if I handled things carefully enough, if I translated well enough, I could keep everyone satisfied. That belief cost me more than I understood at the time. What I didn't see then was how my marriage had shifted the dynamic. Lucas wasn't just a partner. He was a variable they couldn't control. And because they couldn't control him, they began working around him through me, behind me quietly. The methods were familiar. The intent was not. I told myself they were adjusting, that this was the awkward phase of acceptance. I ignored the tightness in my chest after certain conversations. I brushed off the unease that followed visits. I had spent a lifetime learning how to downplay my instincts, and that skill didn't disappear just because I'd married someone kind. Looking back now, I can see that my marriage wasn't viewed as a bond to respect. It was seen as a structure to test, a place where pressure could be applied without leaving fingerprints. And I was still trying to believe that love, real love, would eventually be enough to stop them. It wasn't. The interference didn't arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like something introduced in doses small enough to be questioned, then dismissed. By the time I recognized it for what it had already worked its way into the quiet spaces of our home. My mother began with comments about my parenting. They were framed as observations, not accusations. She asked why I fed our son at certain times, why I handled his tantrums the way I did, why I didn't follow the routines she believed had worked so well for me. Each remark carried the same undertone: I was inexperienced, uncertain, in need of correction. If I disagreed, she sighed and said she worried I was too sensitive. My father took a different approach. He spoke about Lucas when Lucas wasn't in the room. He wondered aloud whether my husband felt comfortable relying on my income at certain points in our marriage. He asked whether Lucas had always planned to benefit from marrying into our family. The questions were never direct enough to refute cleanly. They were designed to linger. At first, I tried to buffer the impact. I reassured Lucas that my parents were difficult but harmless. I told him they meant well, that they just struggled with change. I repeated the same explanations I had used my entire life, hoping they would soften the effect. Instead, I became the conduit. Then the messages started. Private, separate. My parents contacted Lucas directly under the guise of concern. They said they were worried about me, about my mood, about my reliability. They suggested I was overwhelmed, unstable, prone to emotional swings. They framed it as information a good husband should have. A warning delivered politely. One message in particular stayed with me after Lucas showed it to me. My father had written that the women in our family had a history of being difficult, that my mother had endured a lot when she was younger, that patterns repeat unless men are careful. The implication was clear. Loyalty was suspect. Trust was optional. Reading those words, I felt something shift. Not a dramatic break. More like a quiet alignment of pieces that had never quite fit before. This wasn't overprotection. It wasn't concern. It was character assassination executed slowly enough to remain deniable. Lucas didn't confront them immediately. He watched. He listened. He waited. I could see the strain in him, the effort it took to stay calm, to avoid escalating something he didn't fully understand yet. Meanwhile, my parents continued their campaign, alternating warmth and criticism with careful timing. They praised me publicly, questioned me privately. They spoke of family unity while sowing doubt. I began to feel the pressure in ways that were hard to articulate. A tension in my chest when my phone buzzed. A sense of being observed, evaluated. I found myself explaining simple decisions out loud, justifying choices that didn't require permission. Old habits resurfaced. I hated myself for how familiar it felt. The most chilling moment came during a visit when my mother, watching my son play, casually remarked that children absorb everything, that they sense instability, that it's important for fathers to know what they're dealing with. She said it lightly, like a general truth. I heard it as a warning. That night, I lay awake replaying conversations, piecing together patterns I had avoided naming. I asked myself questions I'd never allowed before. What if this wasn't accidental? What if the discomfort I felt wasn't something to overcome, but something to heed? The thought was unsettling. Accepting it meant accepting that the people who raised me were willing to damage my marriage to maintain control. I didn't yet know how far they would go. I only knew that something fundamental had changed. The benefit of the doubt I had extended them for decades was thinning thread by thread. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that distance wasn't avoidance, it might be protection. And still part of me hesitated, because acknowledging danger meant acknowledging loss. And I wasn't ready yet to grieve the parents I had spent my life hoping they could become. I was the one who suggested space. Not as a punishment, not as a statement, just distance. I told myself it was temporary, that stepping back would give everyone time to cool down, to recalibrate. I framed it as maturity, growth. The truth was simpler: I was exhausted. Every interaction left a residue I couldn't shake, and for the first time I admitted that enduring it was costing me more than it was preserving. For a while the silence felt unreal. My phone stayed quiet. No layered messages disguised as concern. No passive observations. I slept better. Lucas noticed before I did. He said I seemed lighter, less braced. I didn't correct him. I was afraid that naming the relief would somehow undo it. Then the call came. My mother had been admitted to a hospital for a heart-related issue. The details were vague, delivered with urgency but little clarity. My father said she was stable, but shaken, that she kept asking for me. The old reflex activated immediately, guilt rising faster than reason. I didn't debate whether to go. I packed a bag, lifted my son from his crib, and drove back into the gravity I'd barely escaped. The hospital room was dim, the kind of quiet that amplifies every movement. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. Fragile in a way I hadn't seen before. When she saw me, her face softened. She reached for my hand and called me her sweet girl. It was a phrase she hadn't used since I was a child. Something in me responded despite myself. Over the next few days, everything shifted. My parents were gentle, attentive. They thanked me for coming. They asked about my life without criticism threaded between the words. They played with their grandson, spoke about the future, about healing. My father apologized carefully, vaguely, for past misunderstandings. He said life was too short to hold on to resentment. I wanted to believe it. Not desperately, but quietly. I told myself this was what change looked like at their age. That fear had rearranged their priorities. That illness had done what distance couldn't. Lucas remained polite, but reserved. He didn't interfere with my hope, but he didn't share it either. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that while I was adjusting to their new tone, they were documenting everything. Conversations, reactions, routines. My mother, still recovering, kept her phone close. Too close. She asked questions I didn't notice at first, about our schedules, about how often Lucas traveled, about my moods, my energy, my stress levels. I answered without thinking. These were my parents. I had been trained to explain myself to them. When they were discharged, they insisted on staying involved. They said it was time to be a real family again, that they didn't want to miss moments. I interpreted that as affection. I didn't consider surveillance. Not yet. There were small moments that should have unsettled me. My mother repeating things I didn't remember telling her. My father referencing conversations I thought were private. I noticed the pattern and dismissed it. Coincidence, I told myself. Shared memory. I didn't want to believe anything darker. Belief would have required vigilance, and I was tired of being alert. Looking back, I can see how carefully the tone was managed, how warmth alternated with just enough vulnerability to keep me engaged, how illness became leverage without ever being named as such. They were patient in a way they had never been before, observant, calm. It felt like reconciliation. It wasn't. By the time I realized the balance had shifted again, I was already exposed. My words, my routines, my vulnerabilities had been catalogued, and I had handed them over willingly, believing I was participating in repair. I still tell myself I acted in good faith, that I did what any daughter conditioned to prioritize family would have done, but the truth is harder to sit with. I returned because part of me still believed they could love me without conditions. That belief blinded me to the warning signs I had finally begun to recognize. Their kindness didn't erase the past, it repackaged it. And while I was focused on healing old wounds, they were preparing something new, something that would make silence impossible. The move was presented as practical. My parents found a place closer to us, close enough to help with the kids, close enough to be available without being intrusive. That was the word they used, intrusive. My mother said it with a small, self-aware smile, as if naming the concern neutralized it. I nodded, even as something in my stomach tightened. At first, their proximity felt manageable. Visits were frequent but short. Offers of help arrived wrapped in politeness. My mother brought meals. My father fixed small things around the house. They praised Lucas for his patience, complimented our home, commented on how well our son was doing. It was disarming. I caught myself wondering if I had misjudged them, if the distance had been the problem all along. Then the questions began. They weren't aggressive. They never are at the start. My mother asked what time I usually went to the gym, whether I preferred mornings or evenings. She asked how long I stayed, what classes I liked, who watched my son while I was gone. I answered without thinking. Routine questions, harmless curiosity. When she asked if Lucas ever minded, I laughed and said he encouraged it. Later, she asked if I'd been feeling restless lately, if I ever felt trapped, if motherhood felt isolating. I told her the truth, that some days were hard, that adjustment takes time. She nodded too quickly, like she was filing something away. I noticed it, then dismissed it. Old habit. My father's approach was less subtle. One evening, while Lucas was in the kitchen, he leaned toward me and asked if we were doing okay financially. He said he worried Lucas might feel pressure providing for a growing family. I corrected him, calmly explained our situation. He smiled and said he only asked because men can feel threatened when their wives are too independent. I felt heat rise in my face. Not anger, recognition. The same pattern. The same reframing of concern into doubt. Still, I didn't confront it directly. I told myself it wasn't worth escalating. That peace required flexibility. That I could absorb a little discomfort to keep things stable. The breaking point didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived in the form of a sentence spoken too plainly to ignore. My father waited until Lucas and I were both in the room. He didn't soften his voice. He didn't pretend it was a joke. He asked Lucas if he was certain our son was biologically his. The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting ever could. Lucas didn't respond immediately. He looked at me first, not for reassurance, but for understanding. For confirmation that he had heard what he thought he heard. I couldn't speak. My throat closed, and with it, years of practiced deflection failed me. My father continued, as if explaining a concern any reasonable man would share. He mentioned my gym schedule, my restlessness. He said these things didn't mean anything on their own, but patterns matter. He said trust should be earned repeatedly. He said he only wanted to protect Lucas from heartbreak. That was the moment something irreversible shifted. Lucas stood up slowly. His voice was steady when he spoke, which frightened me more than if it had been raised. He told my father that accusing his wife was not protection, that planting doubt was not concern, that what they were doing was dangerous. My mother tried to intervene. She said my father didn't mean it that way, that emotions were high, that everyone just wanted what was best for the family. The word family landed wrong. It echoed. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. Not just humiliated, but threatened. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about dismantling my marriage, my credibility. my safety. And they weren't hiding it. That night after they left, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what had happened. My thoughts came in fragments. How long? How much do they know? What have I given them without realizing it? I felt complicit in my own unraveling. Lucas didn't press me. He didn't tell me what to do. He said only one thing, that what my parents were doing wasn't confusion or fear, it was intent. And intent, once recognized, can't be unrecognized. I lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breath. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided my entire life. What if protecting my family meant accepting that my parents were the threat I didn't know the answer yet? But I knew this. Whatever came next, silence would no longer be enough. The days after that confrontation moved slowly, as if time itself needed distance to understand what had happened. My parents didn't call right away. Neither did I. The quiet felt different this time, charged, deliberate. It wasn't the fragile calm that follows avoidance. It was the pause before a decision. Lucas was the first to break it. Not with a speech or an ultimatum, but with clarity. He told me he wouldn't expose our son to people who questioned his existence. He said he wouldn't allow our marriage to be dismantled piece by piece while we pretended it was misunderstanding. He said the word I had never allowed myself to say out loud: danger. I wanted to argue, not because he was wrong, but because accepting it meant surrendering something I had carried my whole life, the belief that if I tried harder, explained better, endured longer, things would stabilize. That belief had shaped me. Letting it go felt like stepping into air. My parents reached out 2 days later. My mother's message was careful. She said my father had spoken out of fear. That stress had made him say something he didn't mean. She asked if we could talk privately, just the two of us, the way mothers and daughters do. The phrasing was familiar, intimate, disarming. I didn't answer right away. I reread the message several times, noticing what wasn't there. No apology, no acknowledgement of harm, only a reframing, only an invitation to isolate. When we did speak, it was on speaker with Lucas beside me. That detail mattered. My mother's tone shifted the moment she realized she didn't have me alone. She said she felt attacked, misunderstood. She said she'd given her life to her children and didn't deserve this kind of distance. My father took the phone and said Lucas was overreacting, that strong marriages withstand scrutiny, that only guilty people fear questions. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, but resolve. It surprised me. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't trying to translate their intentions into something safer. I was hearing them as they were. Lucas spoke then, calmly, precisely. He told them they were no longer welcome in our home, that their access to our family was over. He said this wasn't punishment but protection, that trust once broken in this way couldn't be negotiated back through pressure or guilt. My father laughed. A short, dismissive sound. He said Lucas was turning me against them, that I had always been impressionable. My mother began to cry, not loudly but strategically. She said she didn't recognize me anymore, that I was becoming cold, ungrateful. I found my voice in that moment. It didn't rise. It didn't shake. I said one sentence and I meant every word. I told them I wasn't a child anymore, that they didn't get to wound me and call it love, that their presence in my life was no longer safe. There was silence on the other end of the line. Not stunned silence, calculating silence. My father ended the call without goodbye. The aftermath wasn't immediate relief. It was grief. Not for the people they were, but for the parents I had spent decades hoping they could be. I cried in private. I mourned a version of family that had never truly existed. Lucas held space without fixing. He understood that cutting contact isn't an act of anger, it's an act of acceptance. We blocked their numbers, changed routines, warned our daycare. I hated how necessary it felt. Every precaution reminded me that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a rupture. In the weeks that followed, I noticed changes in myself. I slept more deeply. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. The constant low-grade anxiety that had followed me since childhood began to loosen. It wasn't gone, but it was quieter, manageable. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, I wondered if I had been too harsh, if I had misunderstood fear for malice. Those thoughts came quickly and left more slowly. Conditioning doesn't dissolve overnight. What anchored me was my son, the way he laughed freely, the way he reached for us without hesitation. I thought about the world I wanted him to grow up in, one where love wasn't conditional, one where accusations didn't masquerade as care, one where safety wasn't something you earned by staying small. Cutting contact didn't make me fearless, it made me honest. It forced me to acknowledge that survival strategies aren't meant to be permanent homes, that boundaries aren't betrayals, they're declarations. I didn't know then that this decision would provoke one final devastating attempt to regain control. I only knew that I had crossed a line I couldn't return from, and for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. A year passed without contact. Not a single message, not an accidental encounter, not even a rumor passed through extended family. The silence held. I learned to live inside it. At first, it felt fragile, like something that might crack if I moved too quickly. Over time, it became solid, protective, the kind of quiet you build your life around. Lucas's birthday arrived in early spring. We kept it small, just a few friends, simple food, nothing that required explanation. I was pregnant again by then. Early, careful, still private. The pregnancy carried a different weight this time. Less fear, more intention. We hadn't told many people. We wanted to hold it close until it felt real. The knock on the door came halfway through the evening. I knew before I opened it. Some part of me had never fully relaxed. My parents stood there dressed neatly, faces composed. They looked practiced. My mother held a small gift bag. My father smiled like this was a coincidence. They said they had been in therapy. Family therapy. Individual therapy. They said they had learned a lot. That time had changed their perspective. They apologized not specifically, but repeatedly. For how things went. For pain on all sides. They said they wanted to move forward. I didn't invite them in. Lucas stood beside me. That detail mattered. My mother's eyes flicked to my stomach almost immediately. She noticed before I said anything. We kept the conversation brief. Public-facing politeness. I told them they couldn't stay, that this wasn't the time. My father nodded as if expecting resistance. He said they only wanted to wish Lucas a happy birthday, to show goodwill. Against my better judgment, I let them come inside for a few minutes. I told myself it was controlled, that I was stronger now, that nothing could happen with other people around. When we shared the news of the pregnancy later that evening, quietly, casually, the room shifted. My friends smiled. Lucas squeezed my hand. My mother froze. It was subtle. A pause too long to miss. Her smile faltered, then returned sharper than before. She congratulated us, voice bright. She said how wonderful it was that our family was growing. My father said nothing. Before they left, my mother brought out a dessert she said she had made herself. Something special. She insisted I take a bite. Just one. Her eyes didn't leave my face when she offered it. I said no. I blamed nausea. Pregnancy aversion. I smiled and declined again when she pushed. Something in me had gone still. Not alarmed, alert. I handed the plate to Lucas instead, joking that he should enjoy it for both of us. He laughed, took a bite. What happened next unfolded too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Within minutes, Lucas's expression changed. His skin drained of color. He swayed slightly, then reached for the counter. The room erupted into movement. Someone called his name. I caught him as he collapsed, my hands shaking as I lowered him to the floor. The ambulance arrived fast, too fast for comfort. I rode with him, my mind blank, my body operating on instinct. At the hospital, they moved him through triage with urgency that didn't match anything I'd seen before. Words passed between staff in clipped tones. Unknown ingestion, possible toxin. I sat in the waiting room, my hands resting over my stomach, trying to keep my breathing steady. I thought about the dessert, about my refusal, about the look on my mother's face when she realized I wouldn't eat it. Hours later, a doctor sat across from me. He said the levels in Lucas's system suggested intentional poisoning, not an accident, not contamination, intent. The police arrived shortly after. Security footage from our home filled in the gaps my mind couldn't. My mother alone in the kitchen for a moment too long, her hand moving quickly, deliberately. My father standing watch. When confronted, they didn't deny it. My father said they only wanted to end the pregnancy, that they believed it would reset things, that they never meant to harm Lucas, that they didn't think it would be this serious. Listening to him speak, I felt something inside me finally break, not in pain, but in clarity. There was no misunderstanding left to resolve, no intent to reinterpret. The people standing before me were not confused parents. They were perpetrators. As Lucas lay unconscious in a hospital bed, I understood with devastating certainty that I had never been their daughter in the way that mattered. I had been a variable, a problem to solve, a body to control. And this time, silence was no longer an option. The hospital room was too bright for what had just happened. Monitors hummed softly, indifferent to the fact that my world had narrowed to the steady rise and fall of Lucas's chest. He hadn't woken yet. Tubes traced lines across his body, doing the work his own systems couldn't for the moment. I sat beside him, one hand resting over my stomach, the other wrapped around his fingers, grounding myself in the only proof I had that he was still here. The police asked me to step into a separate room. Their voices were calm, measured, practiced. They told me they needed to ask questions while everything was still fresh. I answered mechanically, recounting the evening in order: the knock at the door, the gift bag, the dessert. I watched their expressions change almost imperceptibly as the details accumulated. Concern shifted into certainty. When they showed me the footage from our security camera, I felt detached, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. My mother stood at our kitchen counter alone, her movements efficient and unhesitating. There was no tremor in her hands, no pause. She knew exactly what she was doing. My father hovered nearby, positioned so he could see the room without being seen himself. It was quiet, ordinary. That ordinariness frightened me more than anything else. They were brought in for questioning that same night. I wasn't present for the initial interviews, but I learned later how quickly their stories unraveled. My mother tried first. She cried. She said she had only wanted to help, that she'd been worried about me, about the stress pregnancy was putting on my body. She claimed the substance was meant to induce a miscarriage, nothing more, as if that distinction mattered. My father was less emotional. He spoke in flat terms, minimizing the risk, emphasizing intent. He said they believed ending the pregnancy would remove the source of conflict, that without another child I would be more manageable, that Lucas would calm down, that families recover from these things. When I was told what he'd said, something inside me went still. Not numb, resolved. There was no grief left to process in that moment. Only a clear, terrible understanding of how they had always seen me, not as a daughter with autonomy, but as a problem to be corrected when it grew inconvenient. Lucas woke the next morning. Disoriented, weak, but alive. The doctors told us how close it had been. A few minutes more. A slightly different dosage. They didn't need to say the rest. I heard it anyway. I told Lucas everything once he was stable enough to listen. I didn't soften the details. I didn't protect him from the truth. He closed his eyes while I spoke, his grip tightening around my hand. When I finished, he nodded once. He didn't ask why. He already knew. The investigation moved quickly after that. Charges were filed. Restraining orders were put in place. Our home became evidence, our lives reorganized around legal timelines and security measures. I gave my statement in a quiet room with a recorder on the table, my voice steady as I described events I had never imagined needing to recount. What surprised me most was how calm I felt while testifying. I didn't shake. I didn't falter. It was as if the years of confusion, guilt, and self-doubt had burned away in the heat of clarity. I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was stating facts. In the weeks that followed, I stayed close to Lucas as he recovered. I attended prenatal appointments under heightened protection. Friends filled our freezer with meals. Strangers held doors a little longer. Life moved forward in small, careful increments. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to pull me under, when I'd remember a childhood birthday, a holiday photo, a version of my parents that had felt almost kind. Those moments passed quickly. Reality had replaced nostalgia with something firmer. The court dates came and went. I answered questions. I listened to arguments that tried to frame intent as concern control, as love. None of it landed. The evidence was clear. The truth didn't require interpretation anymore. When my daughter was born, the room was quiet in a way that felt earned. She cried strong and indignant, filling the space with proof of life. I held her against my chest and felt a kind of peace I had never known before. Not relief, not triumph, just safety. I understood then that justice doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it comes as an ending that finally holds. My parents would face consequences. The law would do what it was designed to do, and I would no longer carry the burden of explaining their behavior to myself. Some bonds break loudly, others fracture under the weight of truth. Mine didn't break at all. It was revealed for what it had never been. The court proceedings unfolded without spectacle. No shouting, no dramatic confessions, just a series of rooms where truth was measured, carefully documented, and weighed. I sat at polished tables under fluorescent lights and listened as my parents' actions were translated into legal language: premeditation, malice, intent. Words I had once associated with distant headlines were now anchored to my own history. When it was time for me to testify, I walked to the stand without hesitation. I noticed how quiet the room became when I raised my hand and swore to tell the truth. My voice didn't tremble. I didn't feel the need to convince anyone of my pain. I spoke plainly. I described what happened. I answered questions. I corrected inaccuracies. I let the record stand on its own. My parents sat across the room. They avoided my eyes. Not out of shame, I didn't sense that, but calculation. As if they were still searching for leverage, for some angle that would reframe what they had done. There was none left. The judge issued protective orders without delay. Contact was prohibited. Distances were specified in miles. Violations were outlined with consequences that required no interpretation. For the first time, boundaries existed outside my body. They were enforced by something larger than my endurance. Lucas recovered slowly but fully. His strength returned in stages, first standing, then walking, then laughter that didn't sound forced. We talked about leaving Colorado long before the case concluded. Not out of fear, but finality. We didn't want reminders. We wanted a clean horizon. Our daughter was born on a quiet morning with rain tapping against the hospital windows. I held her and felt a steadiness I had never experienced before. Not joy that overwhelms, not relief that fades. Something deeper, something anchored. I understood then that safety is not the absence of danger, it's the presence of protection. We moved within months. New state, new routines, new anonymity. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I didn't need to. The life we built afterward was deliberately ordinary. School drop-offs, grocery lists, evenings without tension. The absence of chaos revealed how much space it had once occupied. Sometimes late at night, fragments of the past surfaced. A phrase, a tone, a memory I hadn't examined before. They came without warning and left without ceremony. I didn't chase them. I didn't suppress them. I let them pass through unclaimed. I learned that healing isn't about replacing pain with happiness. It's about restoring choice. The choice to step away. The choice to say no without explanation. The choice to believe your instincts the first time they speak. There are people who will tell you that family is everything, that blood overrides behavior, that forgiveness is a moral obligation. I don't argue with them anymore. I simply live differently. My parents brought me into the world. They did not protect me in it. Both things can be true. What I built afterward with Lucas with our children was not an act of revenge. It was an act of clarity. I didn't win. I survived. And survival, when it's quiet and complete, looks a lot like freedom. There's a version of this story that could end with anger, with vindication, with a final confrontation that feels satisfying in the moment. That's not how life usually works. Sometimes the most meaningful endings are the quiet ones, the ones where you stop explaining yourself, stop waiting for permission, and start building a life that no longer requires endurance as proof of love. If you're listening to this and parts of it felt uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. You don't owe anyone access to your life at the expense of your safety. Distance can be an act of care. Silence can be a boundary. And choosing peace doesn't mean you failed, it means you learned. If you'd like to share, I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it is there. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story mattered to you, your support, whether through a comment, a like, or simply staying until the end, means more than I can say.